Hello and welcome to another episode of Adventurous Appetizers with me, your host, Jonathan Stark, and today we're going to talk about how to describe the damage you deal in Dungeons & Dragons. This is a little thing, but if you've ever been a dungeon master before, you've definitely come across this. So your players are in battle against some vicious bandits, and the player runs up and he rolls and he swings his blade and he cuts his sword across the bandit's stomach, spilling his guts out onto the earth for 6 damage. And of course the bandit's still alive, and you hit each other 1,000 more times for 1 or 2 or 3 points of damage. And how do you describe all this in the game world so that it isn't just ridiculous? And a lot of DMs, we find ourselves resorting to kind of these generic terms for damage, like, oh, the bandit slams into you, or he cuts you, or you feel the bite of his blade, or the claws rake down your face as the owlbear mauls you. These kind of things, they work. I mean, don't get me wrong. This is serviceable, but it doesn't really capture after a while the flow of the battle. It can get repetitive, or just kind of the numbers. There's this dichotomy between the numbers and the description. So today I want to talk about different options for pulling this together. And this is important because the way you choose to describe your combats will ultimately tell the players a lot about the kind of game world you're describing. And the list I'm going to go through today is not by any means exhaustive, but it will give you 3 very different options for how you want to describe your game world. The first one is what I call the Street Fighter or the Mortal Kombat or the Devil May Cry form of description, to use some video game terms. And the reason I pull out those is if you think about like Street Fighter, or let's use Mortal Kombat, because Mortal Kombat's a little bit more bloody. No matter how many times those guys get hit or sliced or diced, the fight just keeps on going. They just get back up. Blood might spew across the screen, and as they take a hit that would just destroy anyone in reality, and they just kind of like shake it off or get back up. Eventually they go down, and maybe in a very dramatic fashion, like someone gets their heart ripped out. But in the meantime, it's all just, you just describe it, and it doesn't matter that these kind of blows would destroy a normal human. So this is the kind of thing where like you roll damage, and the dragon literally breathes fire down onto the Sir Aldrich, and wow, he's on fire. And then it doesn't really matter how much damage it does. You're just describing this massive attack. Or the goblin runs up and just slices blade, throws let's say he throws 3 throwing knives that all embed into you. Again, these are things that would fell a man in normal reality, but here you tell the player how much damage it did, and you move on. Your descriptions are always fun, and they're always big, and you don't worry about like trying to make them realistic. What this does is it makes your players feel a little bit more super powered, which can really work in a high fantasy setting, or if you want your characters to just feel like they could take on hordes of enemies, or just survive things that would fell normal people. If you want your players to feel a little bit more than normal, this is a good way to do that. Keep in mind, it also works the other way around. Monsters are going to feel big and impressive, because your players are going to be stabbing blades through their hearts and driving their daggers into their back and ripping off pieces of their armor and scraping down their blades across their flesh and setting them on fire. And your monsters are going to be taking all that and surviving as well. So they're going to feel bigger too. Form number 2 is a little bit more on the opposite side of the spectrum. It's what I use another video game. Let's call it the Sekiro method. Sekiro is this video game where it's got a really cool mechanic where your enemies have something called poise. And poise is a little bit like a health bar. When it's broken, they become vulnerable, and then you can take them down in a single blow. Before that, you might be striking them here and there, but really you're mostly locking blades, trading blows, and you're just kind of whittling them down. And this is basically, you're thinking of hit points as endurance, and the more you strike somebody, the more their endurance is whittling. And then that final devastating blow is, you've created an opening, their guard has gone down, and you get that one good cut in that brings them down. The way you would describe this sort of thing is unlike the Devil May Cry version or the Mortal Kombat version, where you're describing these massive hits. Here it's all the blade, bounces off your armor, you block it with your shield, but you're getting tired, or you barely, you raise your blade and barely nick it in time, but you're taking some endurance damage. You're losing your cool. Your arm is weakening. You can feel the blows centered through your whole body. And it really helps if you describe to your players what you're doing here, because it can get a little confusing. We've gotten so used from video games to thinking of hit points as just, well, I took damage. That's kind of the terminology. I took damage. That when you're describing how their armor blocked the blow, or their shield turned it away, or they were able to lift their sword at the last minute, it doesn't sound like they're actually getting hit. So you might describe to them before you actually play. You say, hey, when I do combat, or, think of your hit points in my game, it's not going to be your like actual blood and bone and blood. It's going to be like your endurance, like how much you're able to withstand blows before you have that final fatal opening. And then you can describe things like that, like, and you can describe a little bit more of the sword play, just barely darting out of the dragon's fire breath. It is a little tricky to describe because in a world of magical explosions, it can be a little bit unbelievable to think that like you're constantly just surviving one magical explosion after another, the seventh time that you don't die by getting hit by a dragon's icy breath or its poison gas breath or what have you. It can start to feel a little ridiculous, but it does also create a more a grittier game in which like damage really is damaging, and fatal blows are just that. They're fatal, and that can help temper if you want your setting to feel a little less high fantasy and maybe a little bit more George Martin. And if you're somebody who likes describing sword play and the intricacy of each moment of battle, this really lets you play around in that arena rather than just describing big, heavy-hitting video gamey attacks. It's also really good for scenarios that involve more human-to-human contact or humanoid contact, rather than a scenario where the players are going to say, go to hell and fight a bunch of devils, because it is a little bit more realistic. So keep that in mind as you're choosing your style. Also kind of think about your setting and what's going to make the most sense. The third style I want to talk about is it takes a little bit more effort. You have to keep track of your players' lives and know what their hit points are, know how much hit points they have left. And when damage is done, describe the attack relative to their hit points. So if you're fighting if your player is a level 1 wizard with 10 hit points and they're fighting a goblin, and the goblin does 2 damage to them, well, you then can describe that as, the goblin elbows him in the face, or, he rushes forward and the wizard just barely lifts his staff in time to block the scimitar, and feels kind of like a twinge go through him as he realizes he's pulled something. If the wizard takes 9 damage from the goblin, well, geez, then you can say the goblin rushes up and, drives his scimitar deep into the wizard's side and blood wells up, and the wizard looks down and realizes that's his life's blood bleeding out there on the goblin's cave. And he's gonna have to staunch that up or die soon. Similarly, if your players, if you're a little bit higher level, let's say they're level 10 and your barbarian has 100 hit points, then the goblin runs up, does 10 damage. Well, yeah, here you might describe something like the goblin runs up and tries to cut at you, and his blade digs through the thick furs that you wear around your body, leaving a scratch underneath. And you grouse. You think to yourself, "That was my favorite fur." This is something like that. Can make sense for you've got the same creature doing the same damage, but you're making it relative to what your hero's hit points are. This is a method that I think actually works really well no matter what scenario you're in. And the reason for that is that it puts the emphasis on the player's stats. So it makes the player feel like they have some impact on the story, and also that they're growing with the world you're describing. If you've been playing this campaign for a long time, they'll remember being that level 1 wizard and how the goblin was able to cleave right into them. But as they gain a few levels, suddenly the goblins all around them seem to be doing less of those critical blows, less of those life-threatening strikes. And it just kind of makes them feel like, hey, they're getting better at this. Their character is getting better at this. It kind of mixes the two styles. It uses the Devil May Cry kind of attacks for big, heavy attacks, and then uses the more like Sekiro sort of, I broke your poise a little bit. I caught you off guard a little bit for attacks that are not so damaging. The downside to this is that you do have to keep track of a lot more numbers, and you have to actually keep in mind how much damage was done relative to each player's life. But it can be a lot of fun, and it can turn the numbers of a player's character sheet into kind of a meta game for you. So this is the way I like to do it. And I really recommend trying it out. It's something I've only started doing recently. When in the past, I've been going for more of a kind of I tend to drift more towards the Sekiro side of things because I like a little bit more of a realistic, gritty game. One thing that I've noticed in making this change is that combat has become a lot more engaging and interesting, where each fight really seems to be different based on what they're fighting and the scenario, because I'm mixing up my description a lot more. I'm not doing things like, it's not always raking claws and driving steel deep into flesh. It changes, and that makes it more exciting for me too as a DM, because I have to come up with cool things for each new type of creature to do. One last word I'll say on this is, like I said, it's not an exhaustive list, but also you can, just because you choose one of these methods doesn't mean you have to stick to that. For instance, if you're running a really gritty game, using the descriptions of, I'm breaking your endurance down, then by throwing in a sudden kind of Devil May Cry, Street Fighter, bombastic fight, you can really change the player's perception of what they're fighting. So if they've been fighting a bunch of these like poise breaking fights, and then suddenly you're talking about how this bugbear is literally just like grabbing them, ripping strips of flesh off them, punching them so hard their spleen ruptures. I mean, they could really be impressed suddenly by this big villain, and feel like that villain is more powerful than they actually are. Keep in mind, and this is my final word on this, that the numbers are only numbers if you let them be numbers. If you let your game just boil down to everybody has 150 hit points and the enemies have 20 hit points and you did 5 damage, you did 6 damage, that will be your world. But if you turn those numbers into detailed descriptions and let them set the stage for these more intricate combats. You don't have to change any of the rules of the game. You just are using description and storytelling to make the world feel more alive. So, you can take a low-level creature and make him feel really cool and powerful just by describing him that way. Gives a lot of power to the GM, and starts to show you how Dungeons and Dragons is a game that's about more than just the numbers. So I say play around with that, see if that helps. And until next time, may you learn from your critical failures. May you enjoy many a critical success. But above all, keep on rolling.